My name is Sonia Michelle, and I'm Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this discussion of the National Security Enterprise, Navigating the Labyrinth, edited by Roger George and Harvey Rishikof. Before I say anything more about the center or our speakers, let me just ask you to please turn off all electronic devices. This discussion is being not only videotaped but webcast, so any electronic devices that are even on, forget about whether they're on silent, will interfere with the broadcast, so please do that. The Wilson Center for International Scholars, as many of you know, was founded in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, and our mission, as it has evolved over the years, is to bring together the worlds of scholarship and of policymaking. And today's event is very much in keeping with that mission, as the collection of essays that we're about to discuss seems to bridge those two realms. The editors and many of the authors in the collection have themselves operated in both academia and in the policy world, and they really understand both of those in great depth. Indeed, I think it's the scholarly insights that the authors bring to this realm of security policy making, one that often seems opaque and secretive to much of the public. It's the insights they bring that make this such an intriguing collection. Until I had a chance to look at it, I was not aware that the national security enterprise was something that you could say had a culture, but that's exactly the case that's being made here. And as we're about to hear, it's a very compelling one. By bringing the analytics of organizational sociology, among other scholarly disciplines, to bear on governmental bureaucracy, or really a set of interlocking bureaucracies, the authors in the book bring an important perspective to the study of national security, an issue that is, as Brent Scowcroft says in his introduction to the book, a critical one for the 21st century. I'm not going to give full introductions to our speakers because, as you can tell from the bios you have in front of you, they are extremely accomplished. They have long records combined. I think they've been running the government for the last 20 years or 30 years. They have enormous experience in many different realms of government, ranging from the judiciary to various parts of the policy planning and State Department and different aspects of the security enterprise that they're studying here. So they really bring a great deal of expertise. But let me just quickly introduce them briefly. To my immediate left is Harvey Rishikof, who's a professor of national security law at the National Defense University, which is part of the National War College, which is part of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and he's also chair of the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Law and National Security. Our second speaker, the other co-editor of the collection, is Roger George, who teaches national security policy making at Georgetown University and also at the National War College at Fort Leslie McNair. And he has served in the CIA and in various other branches of the security establishment. And as commentator, we're very fortunate to have with us Mark Lowenthal, who is president and CEO of the Intelligence and Security Academy, who has also served in various parts of the government and worked on intelligence for many, many years. So together they bring a tremendous amount of expertise to the subject, and in addition, as I said before, they bring these scholarly insights. So they are going to tell us how to navigate the labyrinth of the national security enterprise. Harvey, the floor is yours.
Well, actually,
I'm sorry.
I think I won the bet on who was going to speak first, so I was thinking about that. Harvey and I have been wonderful co-editors, so it's been a pleasure to work with him. But it's always a negotiation, especially when you're working with a lawyer. I realize I got to go first because it allows Harvey to have the last word, although we do have Mark to clean up at the end here. What I wanted to do very quickly is to make a number of observations about the book. First, to say that the project itself would not have happened were it not for Harvey and I teaching at the National War College and being engaged with some very senior military officers, diplomats, and other members of the national security enterprise. And it gave us an ability to see that there are so many tribes in this government of ours that need further elaboration for us to really understand how the national security enterprise operates. There have been any number of reforms proposed to reorganize the government, but it's our contention that if you don't understand the organizations themselves, whatever structural reforms you want to make will probably fail, at least not be as effective. And it was that kind of realization that started us on this book project a little more than a year ago. And we got encouragement from Georgetown University. Dan Byman, who was head of the Security Studies program there, was very enthusiastic. We got some support from the Georgetown University Press, and they're here today with copies of the book. We got tremendous support from our research assistant, Kirsten McNeil, who's here today to hear the talk. And there are any number of other people we could thank, including the contributors themselves who made the book possible. Selecting them was our biggest challenge because, as Sonia mentioned, we wanted a blend of academia but also practical experience. And many of the authors are, in fact, survivors of the Labyrinth, having served their careers in the State Department or the Defense Department or CIA or the DNI or any other number of agencies we try to cover. We were not comprehensive in the agencies we included. There were others we would have liked to have included, but we just found there was a limit to the number of authors and the length of a book. But I think there's more to be said about different agencies' operations. So what I wanted to do was to briefly describe some of the some examples or illustrations of why these different cultures are so different and why you can't assume that the national security enterprise operates the same way across agencies. It's why we're struggling so much with the whole of government approach. And I just wanted to make 4 quick comparisons. Then I'm going to turn it over to Harvey to talk about some of our conclusions and recommendations. The first comparison I would make is if you look at the chapters on the NSC and OMB, you'll see a stark contrast.
Explain those acronyms.
The National Security Council staff and the Office of Management and Budget. Even within the Office of the President, where these 2 organizations sit, you have 2 very different organizations and very different organizational cultures. You have a National Security Council staff, which serves at the pleasure of the President and changes every 4 years, if not more frequently than that. And if you look at the history of the National Security Advisor, you can see that some presidents run through 3 or 4, if not 6, in the case of the Reagan administration. All of these staff tend to be professionals in a substantive area. They bring with them loyalty to the President. They check their organizational culture, if they're from the State Department or from the Defense Department on loan, when they enter the White House. So in a sense, the NSC has no organizational culture. It's a cult of personality, working for a president. Contrast that with the Office of Management and Budget. It's a career agency, all professionals, or roughly 400 of them, who focus on budgets and dollars. They serve any president, Republican or Democrat. They are supremely loyal, supremely discreet, and they are there long after any president leaves. They are the institutional memory of the Office of the President on a budget. And so these 2 organizations somehow have to coexist, serving the President in very different domains with very different objectives in mind. And as you read these chapters, you'll see that even within the Office of the President, OMB and the NSC staff are not always working hand in glove. Some of the examples that Gordon Adams gives in the chapter on the Office of Management and Budget point out that he would get conflicting advice from different NSC directors over budget priorities all the time. And we still fail to have a truly whole-of-government national security budget, something which Gordon argues is something we desperately need. Given this era of austerity, I think he's probably right. The second comparison I would make is to the State Department versus the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD. You have 2, again, very large, separate cultures. One culture lives primarily overseas, in foreign embassies, serving U.S. interests abroad, and comes back to Washington somewhat reluctantly to work in Maine State Department, but their careers are really all about getting promoted to ambassador to work overseas. Their chief job skill is to negotiate, to compromise, to get things done, but also to manage things that are insoluble. Within the State Department, you have subcultures. You have bureaus where an officer can spend their whole career as a Europeanist or as a Middle East hand. So even within the State Department, you have these subdivisions that help define how the State Department will behave. And if you go to an interagency meeting, often the DOD would shrug and say, we got to wait for State Department to make up its mind because the bureaus are battling. We don't know what the State Department position is. Depends on who shows up at the meeting. Contrast that with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is made up of civilian and military officers. It's strongly inured with that concept of unity of command, and they will come with one position. Now, the one exception to that is with the Goldwater Nichols, you now have a joint staff which has its independent opinion provided to the Secretary of Defense, and you have the civilian Office of the Secretary of Defense providing its own opinion to the Secretary. So theoretically, DOD now can show up with two opinions, the Joint Staff and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. But often they will try to work that out before they arrive at the interagency meeting. One other big difference between the two organizations I'll just highlight is the number of political appointees you find in these two agencies. You hear the State Department complaining often that too many political ambassadors. But in reality, roughly 80 to 85% of all the senior positions are held by careerists. It's exactly the opposite in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Most senior positions are held by political appointees who will reflect the current or new administration's views on defense policy. Practically speaking, that means if you're a careerist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, you don't have a lot of hopes of ever being promoted to an assistant secretary or maybe even a deputy assistant secretary. And one of the points made by the authors of that chapter was we really do need a more career track for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So we have an institutional memory and we can create a stronger culture. Right now, I think you'd argue OSD does not have a very strong culture because that too shifts with the political appointees who come in versus a State Department culture that is very well honed to support the interests of the bureaus and the careerists who largely make up that organization. Mark Grossman, who wrote the State Department chapter, makes the point that, you know, it's a strong culture, but it's one that is a little bit resistant to change. And as much as we'd like to rebalance military and civilian capabilities, if you simply give Department of State more money, but don't change the culture and develop new skills and new missions for a foreign service officer, you're not necessarily going to get a better result. So it's not just about the money, although that's an important issue. The third comparison I'd make is between CIA and DNI. As a former member of the CIA, culture.
DNI, Director of National Intelligence.
Ah, yes, Director of National Intelligence, sorry.
CIA, they probably
CIA, you probably understand. As someone who served 30 years in the CIA, I can tell you there's very strong culture there. In fact, you would argue there are almost two agencies. You have a clandestine service, and you have a directorate for intelligence. One is the operators, the other is the analysts. They operate almost independently of each other in some respects. They're trained separately. They're rewarded differently. A clandestine officer is obviously rewarded when he recruits a spy or reports something very exciting in secret channels. And an analyst is promoted if he makes a good judgment, or she briefs the president, or she writes a great paper. Those two cultures come together somewhat uncomfortably. As a career analyst or former career analyst, I felt the National Clandestine Service always was the top dog, and I think if you look around and ask enough CIA officers, they'd all agree with that. That culture is very security conscious, meaning there's got to be strict need-to-know principles, and that has in some ways limited the analyst's ability to reach out and talk to others outside the agency. Contrast that with the DNI. the Director of National Intelligence, the newest kid on the block in the intelligence community, the organization that's supposed to organize all 16 independent intelligence agencies, is this in fact an agency? That's the first question. Most on Capitol Hill would say, we don't want to create a 17th intelligence agency called the DNI. You're just supposed to coordinate things. So in a way, you have a DNI which has no culture. It is a conglomeration of the 16 because it's made up largely of people coming from those 16 agencies. It's trying to define its unique mission that differs from what CIA, Defense Intelligence, the National Security Agency, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and the other alphabet soup agencies in the community do. And it's been very hard for the DNI to define that culture, compared with CIA, which knows exactly what it's supposed to do. We recruit spies, we conduct covert operations, and we write intelligence reports. The DNI has come on some hard times lately. I think one of the clearest examples I can think of where a former director of national intelligence didn't understand the cultures was when Dennis Blair proposed that the DNI take over responsibility for assigning the senior intelligence rep in embassies overseas. This was a direct challenge to the clandestine service, which had done this since the beginning of time. They were not going to cave on this. The DNI lost the battle. I don't think Denny Blair, even though he was sharp and knew a lot about the military, understood the intelligence cultures in which he was now swimming. But you could cite other examples of this as well. The fourth comparison I'd make is between the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation,
Steady there.
and the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. Now, I'm on thin ground here because Harvey has served in the FBI, but I'm trying to summarize some of his chapters, so I'm sure he's going to correct me anyway. FBI is, again, another agency with a deeply, strongly held culture. The special agent in charge. That is the clandestine service officer or the DI analyst or the State Department diplomat. This is a person who has come up through the ranks, knows how to fire a weapon, knows how to make arrests, has worked in the field, and has checked the boxes to become a very senior officer in the FBI. It knows what its missions are. You arrest criminals, you arrest terrorists, and you stop counterintelligence activities in the United States. It's a very decentralized organization where field offices are somewhat independent. That's changed since 9/11, as I'm sure Harvey would tell you, and as he mentions in the chapter. But it had a lot of independence. Now, contrast that with the Department of Homeland Security, again created at the beginning of the 9/11 era, whose mission still remains to be very carefully defined. If you look at the statute establishing the DHS, you would think it was only supposed to do terrorism. And yet, what has it been focused on most recently? Immigration issues, natural disasters like Katrina, cyber has now been added to the list. It's got a very broad and somewhat ill-defined mission, and as a result, it doesn't really have a single culture. It's made up of 22 separate agencies that were shoved together after 9/11 to bring the relevant pieces of other departments together that could work as a single agency. And I think 3 secretaries of DHS have been working to create that common culture. So even on the domestic side, we have 2 agencies doing some of the same things, but not doing it nearly the same, looking at those 2. I would guess, and Harvey would probably support this, if we have another 9/11 kind of event, there's going to be a big question of whether FBI or DHS are up to the task, and should there be a domestic intelligence agency. And that is sort of an issue that's hanging out there. Not that I wish to see what would happen after another 9/11. So these are just some examples of the wide variability in these cultures that we're operating in the national security enterprise. I haven't mentioned the Congress, the role of the media, think tanks like this one that play a huge role in shaping the national debate, educating policymakers, and being a forum for new ideas. But when you think about all this, it's no surprise that it's difficult to get the U.S. government to operate in a way that we're all singing from the same music. The interagency process has to somehow accommodate all of these different approaches, expectations, standard operating procedures that differ across all these agencies, and it means that it's not a pretty sight when policy is actually made. So at that point, I think I'll turn it over to Harvey.
Thank you, Roger. First, let me say that you can tell that Roger and I had an extraordinary, joyous collaboration with each other. Let me begin on behalf, from my legal perspective, of Roger, myself, and probably Mark. Everything we say is not the National War College or Department of Defense. We're not speaking on behalf of those entities. I'm not speaking on behalf of the American Bar Association, nor am I speaking on behalf of the DNI. This is really our work that we did looking at the issues that we had spent our careers working through and working with. The first issue is I also want to thank Sonia and the Woodrow Wilson Institute for being so kind to host this. And you will see on the back of the book, we have a quote from Lee Hamilton, the former head of Woodrow Wilson, and I understand Jane Harmon's going to take over, who had a great deal of experience in HIPSI, which is the House Intelligence Committee on Security, a permanent intelligence side on the House. And they've been very, very helpful in trying to go forward. The reason why that's significant is that the book is broken up, as Roger said, into 3 parts. We have the big dogs, which are the 10 big agencies that are usually when associates when thinks of national security. But we've included people like the OMB, the Office of Management Budget, that normally you don't have. And we also, if you'll see in our introduction one, have USAID, the United States International Development Agency. Because our argument is that increasingly when one thinks about what national security is, the definition over the last 15 to 20 years has expanded dramatically since what we know was 9/11, but what the Europeans know is 11/9, and 11/9 is when the wall came down. So the second level of the book is also what you don't normally see. We deal with chapters on Congress and the Supreme Court. And the reason we thought it was important to have the Supreme Court is increasingly we have seen a very aggressive court involve itself in national security issues, probably the most prominent being the decision by the court, whether you agree or disagree with it, to assert its power in habeas corpus for the detainees in Guantanamo. As we sit here today, the district courts of Washington, D.C. are litigating the issue of who is part of al-Qaeda and how do you become a member of al-Qaeda. That is being done by the federal courts of the United States. It's not being done by the executive branch. It's not being done by the legislative branch. And we use as a theme across the book the case study of Iraq to see how each of the entities entered into the Iraq debate. And the final section we have, which includes the Woodrow Wilson Institute, is we look at the players that have a huge shaping function for the debate, particularly those of us who have been involved in what I call are the mandarins in the cylinders of excellence. You also may know them as the gorillas in the cylinders of excellence. Do we have any SES, Senior Executive Service people in the room? Raise their hands. Self-identify if we have an SCSer in the back so they know what I'm talking about. And we include people like the lobbyists, the think tanks, the media, which when you're involved in these positions, you usually get involved with these 3 entities. So the argument that we put forward was that to think through the modern national security enterprise, there are 3 levels of interaction. There's the interaction with your sister agencies, which include also the National Security Council. There's your interactions with the court as a court strategy, and your interactions with the legislature as a legislative strategy. And then the final is what we sort of the idea machines. The idea machines are the think tanks, are the press that help set the agenda. I mean, it's very common when you're in the federal government that you begin your day with used to be a wad of papers, which were all the news stories that affected your agency. And we'd go to meetings at 7 a.m. in the morning, and we'd be leafing through very quickly to see how the world press and the national press had covered our entities to help set the agenda for the day as to what meetings we were going to attend. So what Roger said to me, sort of in a nutshell, when you think of what the core is, on page 347 of the book, we have what we call the algorithm for Mandarins. And the algorithm of Mandarin power is jurisdiction equals FTE and money. FTE stands for full-time equivalents. You would know it as people. And our argument is, when we started thinking about the problem, the last sort of large book that had been dealt with bureaucracy issues, which you probably know is Essence of Decision, was the Graham Allison book, which was a standard reading for most graduate classes when we were in graduate school. And basically the Allison argument is, where you stand is where you sit. That has always been sort of the issue in bureaucratic politics. What Roger and I thought we were going to go for the next level beneath it is not only where you stand is where where you sit is where you think, or where you stand, is it's how you think. Our argument is that these bureaucracies create a logic vis-a-vis how you enter into the discussion of national security issues. The classic example, which Roger alluded to, was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We would always used to say about the FBI that it wasn't the Federal Bureau of Interest. We were interested only in prosecutions. Our goal was an event took place, and then we launched investigations to prosecute and bring to justice the individuals who had committed the crime. In the under Louis Freeh and Bear Bryant, we started moving towards what we were calling a prevention paradigm. We were trying to institute an idea of a leaning forward posture in order for us to stop things from happening. That is a major cultural, institutional shift, which makes the Bureau much more of an intelligence entity in the domestic context and willing to act on it. The issue that you will now see being brought to bear by the national security enterprise is that we now are talking about the concept of preventive detention. Preventive detention is a concept in which you will be leaning forward to identify individuals that you believe are dangerous and securing them in the legal apparatus. That's a huge shift. So if you understand that notion of jurisdiction equals money and people, the core that we found is the fights over jurisdiction and how your cultures reflect that fight over jurisdiction. The most recent that we allude to in the book is the other tension between the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency over what's referred to as Title 50, which is the United States Code, which authorizes the agency to act, and Title 10, which is the part of the code which authorizes the Army to act. So one of the core issues that we've dealt with as an enterprise is when you're in clandestine activities, what falls under the jurisdiction of the military and what falls under the jurisdiction of the agency. Why that's significant is because of our statutes, clandestine activity and types of covert action require reporting to the Congress, to the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Select Committee, if it's part of the CIA entity. If it's traditional military activities, they do not require reporting to the Congress. It's a classic sort of jurisdictional fight that we're having over what requires reporting, what doesn't, and who is constituted to perform those functions and who isn't constituted to perform those functions, or if they do, what is their authority vis-a-vis responsibility for reporting to the Congress. These are very, very serious core issues about how we enter into the fray of securing what we think is the Republic's national interests. So what are the things we recommend? Well, one of the things we recommend is, like all Mandarins, we care very deeply about the Republic, but people care about their promotions and careers. And you will find that in the different silos of excellence, that you will be rewarded for certain types of activity by your superiors and penalized for other types of activities. So how well you played in the interagency game has never been something that most Mandarins think is important in your career path. And one reason is because when you look at the promotional issues, they are cut off vis-a-vis their own entities. It's such that even when you go to the military, the promotional boards for the Marine Corps, for the Army, for the Navy, for the Coast Guard, for all the four big services, they do it themselves Those boards are internal. There aren't individuals who sit on other parts of the military for promotion. So one of our radical recommendations is you should have across the board senior executive promotional boards, so that representatives from all of the core agencies would say, when the name like George Jameson comes up, well, does he play well with others in the interagency game? Since I know George, the answer is yes. He would then be promoted up into the higher echelons. You would have a relationship of knowing of the senior rising managers. Do they understand the whole of government? Are they willing to play? Another issue we have is when you think about accountability. When you look at the culture of the National Security Council, which Roger alluded to, we're in another project with the American Bar Association, the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and the Project on National Security Reform on what should the structure look like for the National Security Council for the 21st century. Well, one of the distinctive cultural bureaucratic characteristics of the NSC is that the National Security Advisor is not confirmed by the Senate, whereas all the other senior players are confirmed by the Senate. This means that the Senate has no review of that particular entity that stands beside the President. Now, there are arguments for and against the concept of creating that national security manager to be confirmed by the Senate, to have that authority. But you can see, as I raise that as a possibility for reform, all of the mandarins start thinking through, what does that mean vis-a-vis accountability issues? What does that mean vis-a-vis the power of the president having a secure advisor who is not going to be called for Senate or committee hearings? But this is what we wanted to put on the table for people to start thinking about. How do you start moving this large, colossal apparatus to get control? An example which I'll pass around just to give you the complexity of the apparatus is that we have it in the book in a black and white chart. This is just the entities involved governing agencies for combating nuclear proliferation. And I'll pass it around so you can see each box, each jurisdictional issue of the size of this. How do you get control? Once you take power is one of the great sort of $64,000 questions that people like us who are involved in allegedly trying to affect policy try to work through. The other issue is that I would raise before we sort of turn it over to Mark for commentary is we were very conscious of the internal factors inside these bureaucracies and how those internal factors shaped cultures. So are there any Navy people in the room? Want to raise your hand if you're anyone in the Navy? That's odd. We usually have someone. Is there any FBI? Because usually in the FBI I always ask, good, are you packing? That's usually what I want to know.
Right.
Okay, you're not.
That's a different culture.
You're not packing, good, because it's very important when I raise these issues. When I was a legal counsel at the Bureau.
No, but you notice that they always have the Glock and the BlackBerry on the same hip, so he may pull out the wrong thing. It's okay.
It's the agency speaking. So the
Don't shoot.
So the issue there is we used to call it, if you know the military and Navy, brown shoe, black shoe, soft shoe. So brown shoe is usually individuals who are involved in the aircraft carriers, nuclear aircraft carriers, and we affectionately refer to them as airdales. They're the individuals who land on the aircraft carriers. It takes a certain personality type. And the black shoes are usually called SWOs, surface warfare officers. They have their own idea of when they're in command of the ship, their ability to control phenomena. And then finally, the soft shoe is submariners, the people who live underwater. As we say, their emotional range is about like this. Because you don't want men and women who have a tendency to panic under situations when you're underwater with a nuclear power plant. So my sense of we try to take that concept and expand it to the entire entity of the enterprise for you to read. So one of the examples we said was, we used the phrase, if you had a rabbi, which is a mentor, who would look to you and say, well, you now have joined the State Department, what would the mentor say to you vis-a-vis advice to grow up through the system? That was part of the level of the book. And Mark Grossman's article sort of lays out that for you. What's important? What's significant? What does that entity identify as its important mission? Not its mission vis-a-vis the rest of the national security enterprise, but its mission. So I will end, so it's much more interesting to hear Mark speak and your comments. When I teach at the National War College, I asked the military at one point, if you give an order and the order is not followed, how does your culture react to it? So I have mostly colonels, which are 06s and 05s, lieutenant colonels, and we have some international fellows from a country which I will not mention. You'll see why at the end of the joke. So I asked the Navy says, well, that's pretty simple, sir. If we give an order, it's not answered, not following the ship. It's, we arrest them in the brig, bread and water, 1 week, we move on. Interesting, Captain. I said to the Army colonel, what would you do? He says, well, sir, if we're in maneuvers and we have someone in the platoon or the brigade doesn't follow orders, we arrest them on the spot. I'll take 2 soldiers, we'll go to regimental headquarters, we'll start an investigation, the United States Military Code, we will court-martial them. Great. So I say to the Marine, what would you do? He says, sir, you got to gag and bag. I go, gag and bag? He says, sir, we're on a mission. You put a gag in his mouth, put it in a bag, we'll see, we'll go and continue the mission, come back, he's still alive, we'll talk to him and see what's going on, why he wouldn't want to do this. It's interesting. Marine Corps is always very discipline-oriented. And I said, what about the Air Force? And the Air Force said, Air Force, someone not following order? Well, sir, that would require we're on a B-52. There must be about 6 of us in the plane. We'd be curious why they wouldn't want to do it, but we're all cross-trained. The function will be performed. We'll land. I'll say to the person, hey, what's up with that? Why aren't you interested in performing the function here? And then we had the international fellow. I said, what are we doing? He says to me, is it war or peace? I said, does that really make a difference to you? And he said, absolutely. I said, it's peace. Well, I'll shoot him once. I said, it's war. He goes, I'll shoot him twice. So he became known as Double Tap as a result of that. And, of course, when he made his explanation, a member of the military said, can we go back to that system? I said, no, we're not going back to that system. Well, he's here for us to explain to him the rule of law and what we understand with war. But that little joke demonstrates certain issues about how one understands authority and how you impose that authority. And we say through the enterprise, for the Big Ten, that form of authority for what makes you successful is in the book. Then the logic of the second level is how the unpredictable Congress and courts get involved. It's the second level of curiosity. And finally, the think issues, the groups that are generating projects and ideas for the next level for reform. That's what we wrote it for. We wrote it for students, and we wrote it for practitioners to help them think through the issue of how to create the enterprise to be a more rational policy instrument than from time to time it is. And with that, I'll stop talking and give it to Mark.
Thanks very much, Harvey. Mark?
Thanks. And thanks for inviting me. I look around the table and I see a lot of fellow veterans from meetings past, meaning in the government, and some of you are just here because you actually have an abstract academic interest. So first of all, notice the words that people are using: survivors, labyrinth. I mean, we're not talking about Candyland here. We're talking about a sort of a hard-edged, sharp elbows kind of place. But let me tell a couple of anecdotes to sort of give you context. In the late 70s and 80s, when I was working at the Congressional Research Service, I wrote a series of papers on how we verify arms control agreements. And I wrote this by getting people in the executive branch to help me through this. And then I got seconded, as our British friends say, detailed to the Pall Mill Bureau to work on the same issues. And the first interagency meeting I went to, Admiral Howe was the the director of Pall Mill, and Richard Pearl, known to everyone as the Prince of Darkness, was the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And the meeting went south very fast, and Richard Pearl got up and walked out of the meeting. And we all just sort of sat there looking at each other like, okay, now what happens? And then finally the Admiral got up, and we all started filing out. And I walked past the CIA officer who had helped me with the paper, Doug George, who some of you remember, ran the Arms Control Intelligence Staff. And Doug stopped me and he said, if I had told you it worked this way, would you have believed me? And obviously the answer was no. You had to see this. You had to experience this. The other anecdote was I then went back to state on a second tour, this time as an employee, in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, working for Mortar Bramowitz. And every week, every office had to file a progress report. What did you do? And most of the offices, we wrote this paper and we wrote that paper and we briefed this guy. My guys went to meetings. We did arms controls. They went to this IG and this WIG and this interagency group, and that was basically what we did. And one day the ambassador calls me and he says, Lowenthal, do your people ever write anything? And I said, not really. He said, why not? I said, because that's not how arms control works. We go to meetings. We represent intelligence interests of the department. And he sort of said, okay, fine. Now, the thing that was funny about this is that Mort had been an arms control ambassador. Mort had been the head of the Mutual and Balanced Force Reduction, which some of you remember. This was between us and the Goths and the Romans, and it went on for about as long as the Empire. And Mort, sitting at the top of this, had no idea how positions got to him. No idea why we took this. They just, somebody would say, all right, this is where we are negotiating. And so that's sort of what it's like. And as you move up, even though the people who move up, who are mandarins, I kept thinking about Sir Humphrey as you kept saying that, they lose track of what it was like to be in the trenches, and they no longer appreciate what's happening below them. Now, there are lots of other ways you could organize the system. Our way is uniquely ours. It is a federative system. We are a federal republic. We reflect that. And one of the things that comes out in the book that's very important is it wasn't planned. Nobody sat down in 1947 with a big butcher block and said, okay, I want one of those and one of these. A lot of it just happened. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not begin the way you think it did. The Joint Chiefs, on February the 9th, 1942, wrote a memorandum to the President saying, Mr. President, we have organized ourselves as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And FDR, he used to use these big blue crayon pencils, wrote, okay, FDR. I've held this piece of paper at the Hyde Park Library. And they became the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 5 years later, by law, they became the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Nobody planned the intelligence community. It just sort of grew. In fact, Richard Helms told my staff when I was on the HIPSI that you wouldn't build this way from scratch, but you'd still end up with the same community. And so you have to appreciate the experimental, federative nature of the system, which is what comes out in the book. Now, I have to know there are ways to make it even harder. And I was thinking about this as I was reading the book, because I had this for a while, there was this officer at the Soviet embassy with whom I used to have conversations, which I reported, of course. And one day we were having lunch, and he said, when you were at the State Department and you went to an interagency meeting, who paid for your time? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, who did you bill? I said, I didn't bill anybody. I was on a salary from the State Department. I said, do you bill people? He said, oh, yes. I said, you like lawyers? He said, oh, yes. I said, well, no wonder you guys are in trouble. I said, if we had that kind of system, we'd spend all day just billing. Let's see, a sixth of an hour at the Defense Department, 20 minutes at CIA. I mean, I said, no wonder you guys are going under. So it can always be worse, as bad as ours is. So when you pick up the book, the first thought you have is, didn't somebody write this before? And the answer is no. Nobody's done this before. I mean, it's one of those we say there's got to be 5 of these out there. There's none of these out there, which is always a good thing if you're the author of the book. I'm speaking from experience here. But, I mean, I was stunned when Roger and Harvey were working this, and I said, nobody's done this, huh? And it is unique, and it is important. And the book has a series of strengths that are just, if you've been in this system, you appreciate them right. First of all, it is not this wonderfully dry, abstract poli-sci textbook. This is about real people doing real things in real time. And it's written by people who've been there, done that. And that alone makes it worth the price of admission in reading the book. It casts a very wide net, and they've sort of laid out the net for you. One of the things that struck me was that, yes, you should have a chapter on think tanks. And there should be a chapter on OMB. And there should be a chapter about the courts and the Congress and the media. Now, you could add to that if you wanted to, but it is more than just the agencies that you know, the usual suspects, as they say in Casablanca. And finally, the last, and I think the most important part of the book, is the book that they both touch on, and that's the culture thing. You are not going to understand this unless you understand individual cultures and subcultures and subcultures. You know, Harvey just took you down through the Navy one. In the CIA, Rogers, in fact, the DO always has, you know, like you go to the European office Christmas party, is very different than the East Asia office Christmas party. The food is different. I mean, in the clandestine service, they take on the culture of the people that they're trying to turn, which I guess is good. It's probably useful. But in the State Department, the same thing. The European party is very different than the Inter-American Affairs Bureau party. People go native. But you're not going to understand the system unless you understand the cultures and the subcultures. We do this experiment with in one of our D&I classes. We usually have 11 or 13 agencies represented in the room. We ask everybody to describe what is the dominant culture of your agency. And then we go around a second time and ask everybody else, how do you see that agency? So, for example, the CIA culture is, we work for the president. The other view of the CIA is arrogant, da-da-da-da-da-da. The FBI culture, even if you're an analyst and you've never handled hardware in your life, is we carry, we pack. And so we give these are junior employees that have not been there for more than 3 years, a sense to understand that it's not only you understanding their culture, you have to understand how you are viewed. And that's one of the things that comes across very strongly in this. It's the Robert Burns thing, you know, what a gift that God would give us to see ourselves as to see us. The final point, you know, they make a bunch of recommendations, and we could argue about them all day and all night. To understand this lovely block chart, and I think everybody's on it, is anyone missing? Good God. Anyway, if you're going to make change in the intelligence community, you do not make it wholesale. You make it retail. You have to shop it around. Everybody on the charts. And I had a real-time experience of this. We created when I was working for Georgetown, we created a new priority system for intelligence for the president. It's still the system that this administration is using. And the way we sold this is we went to every agency and separate offices and agencies and briefing after briefing. And if somebody made a change, and you go back to the first ones. And I had this wonderful officer working for me, a guy named Mark Roth. And I told him, when we get to briefing 100, I buy you a bottle of champagne. He got the bottle of champagne, and we kept going. When we stopped, we were at 133 briefings. But then when we went to the White House, as we're getting out of the car, and the tenant says to me, "Is this a done deal?" I said, "It's done. There's nobody going to disagree with you. It will be in and out in half an hour." And we were. But that's because we spent 18 months shopping this around to all these different offices. So if you're going to make changes, you don't dictate changes from the bridge, because nothing on the bridge is connected to any of the moving parts. You have to get down into the offices and sell it piece by piece by piece. And that's also the way policy gets made. And this is the last point. Because to understand the system, you have to understand that it's like being in the Senate. Now, I'm a House rat, so I'm biased. But the Senate has one rule, UCRs, unanimous consent requests. Everything that happens in the Senate requires unanimity. You just need one of those 100 saying, "I object." And that's the way the bureaucracy is. Everything that moves through bureaucracy is unanimous. If somebody says semicolon and you say comma, okay, let's discuss this. And they actually have different meanings if you're writing certain language. So that's the real strength of the book, is getting you into the nitty-gritty of the cultures and the interests and how players take this on as they move around. You get imbued in the culture. And it's just an absolutely essential book. Everybody will have it in their reading list. I know I will. And they've done a great service by laying it out the way they have.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much for laying out the book and giving us a sense of what it means to what it's going to mean in this field from now on. We have a couple of mics ready. Please identify yourself and try and keep your questions brief.
Yes, Frank Fletcher, former Army artillery.
See, not Army, but Army artillery.
Exactly.
Right, field artillery, not air defense.
So we'll speak loudly when we're
Certainly, the Reagan administration had no shortage of very strong personalities, not just at the level of secretaries, but the NSC, assistant secretaries of defense, which was mentioned. So, and they didn't always agree. So that exacerbated the normal bureaucratic tensions are always extant. But if a president makes something a high priority, he'll often do something like happened in the Reagan administration and create an ad hoc working group, like the Active Measures Working Group. Mm-hmm. And if a president and his national security team really think it's important, and they also, the covert actions against the Soviet Union, like working with labor unions and the Catholic Church and Solidarity to undermine in Eastern Europe, and other activities in the Baltics. But if a president makes something very, very a high priority, and does that make a difference? And then what about the issue of these ad hoc working groups, like the Active Measures Working Group?
Yeah. In the NSC chapter, the author, Dave Auerswald, talks about some of these informal groups that every president has relied upon, not just groups. Sometimes the president will decide, I want to open relations with China, and you send Henry Kissinger and don't tell anybody else. So there are ways to avoid the bureaucracy when secrecy or confidentiality is important, But the thing to keep in mind is you can win that first battle by initiating that relationship, but at the end of the day, bureaucracies will have to implement any policy initiative you have started. So you have to consider whether these informal mechanisms are going to be effective for the long run. And virtually every president has used an informal mechanism. I think George Bush Sr. had the UNGroup when they were looking at the fall of the Soviet Union.
That was my favorite one, the UNGroup.
The UNGroup.
It's like
we
it's like an
meetings
unpaper.
and we have unpapers, and so that is one technique. And now we have the super envoys.
Right.
The president's envoy to Afghanistan, who's supposed to somehow bring State Department more into the loop when CENTCOM seems to be driving a lot of what's going on in South Asia. So there are these vehicles, and we're not saying they shouldn't be used, but you have to consider the consequences.
The dynamic of the system is to spin. In a unanimous system, who has the most power? The one who says no. It's the Nancy Reagan thing, just say no. So in the case of arms control with the Soviet Union, the Reagan administration, OSD can say no and say no and say no, but Ronald Reagan really doesn't want to make a deal. Then he has this epiphany about Gorbachev, and I remember Bob Linhart, who's gone now, came to one of these meetings and said, the president wants a deal. Now Richard Perle is not bucking Admiral Howe. Who's Richard Perle bucking? Now he's bucking the president. So unless the president wants it to happen and tells the system, stop spinning, the system will spin. But most of the time, they don't do that. It just spins unless, and there's a difference between fighting with the State Department and fighting with the president.
Your point is very well taken. On page 35 of the book, we lay out, the author Dave does, for each president what we call the alternative security forums. So Kennedy had the XCOM. Johnson had what we called the Tuesday lunches, where he beat with Pontus, President of the United States, the DOS, DOD, NSA, plus DCI, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Nixon used to have basically the Kissinger meetings, and he and Kissinger would decide what was going on, and they would not inform the State Department.
Or the Secretary of State.
Reagan had,
he knew.
this is a parlor trick for people in our line of business. I will offer you the first part of the question is a free trip to Europe, but you have to also ask the second part. Can you name Reagan's 6 national security advisors? Which is a parlor trick. So the parlor trick actually is Allen, Clark, McFarland, Poindexter, and Carlucci. Most people forget Carlucci. So Bush 41 had the Big 8 meetings. The point we make is everyone figures out how to get around this problem and create a small core that they then set out. They don't reform the bureaucracy. They don't change the bureaucracy. They figure out a way to maneuver through the complexity. The second issue is the turning point for the Reagan administration is Iran-Contra. So Iran-Contra is a clear turning point. There's been a great deal of ink spilt on that issue, but we all agree that somehow the National Security Council became operational and not a coordinating phenomena. And many in the system believe when you bring that level of operation so close to the president, and there appears to be a defiance of the Congress and a potential violation of laws and clearly a violation of the spirit of the entity. And the little anecdote you should know is at that time there's a guy named Dick Cheney who's a congressman, and the Iran-Contra investigation by Congress, the gentleman who writes is the author of the Minority Report is a man named David Addington. David Addington goes on to become the general counsel for Dick Cheney under 43. And if you read the Minority Report of the Iran-Contra, which I recommend to you, you will see all of the ideas of the executive authority and the power of the presidency in full, because that Minority Report believed that the president had the right to use the National Security Council, the president had the right to use monies that were outside of the Congress's authority, that the president had the right to reinterpret what it believed was constraints being placed by the Congress in the appropriation bill, and that all talked to executive authority. That, for us, is a perfect example of the culture occult around an executive power, how we use the law to defend it, and then you ram it home. So your question is actually apropos for what we see as the way you have a bureaucratic solution to a bureaucratic problem. Tight, controlled, get around it, but don't change it. Yeah.
Yeah, this one right here.
Hi, I'm Annette Brown with the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. And my question is, what is the scope for evidence-based policymaking within this enterprise? Is anybody embracing it? Are they trying to start measuring things? Or does most of the enterprise consider itself outside of that kind of initiative?
Well, go ahead, I'll go.
Henry Kissinger made a statement many years ago about bureaucracy and foreign policy, and he said, when you get above the assistant secretary level, nobody's thinking anymore. They're just reacting. And I think, given the size of the U.S. bureaucracy, evidence or information can only go so high. And then people are operating on instincts, sort of personality, gut, if you will. So I think you find it, certainly in the intelligence community, we like to think we're evidence-based for making judgments, even when we have to caveat it with certain assumptions. But at some point, maybe at the deputies or the principals committee level, that's probably not going to make it.
I would say the issue of matrix and evaluation has seized different bureaucracies. Under Rumsfeld, the idea of the matrix and evaluating programs for the military became a very high priority. So my response to that usually is, we always say the key to judgment, the key to leadership is one word: judgment. And judgment usually is involved knowing imponderables, what the agency likes to refer to as mysteries. How you understand a mystery as it unravels is a judgment issue. And the things we care the most about, you cannot measure. For today's Valentine's. Well, how much do you love your spouse?
The $28 box, the $45 box, you know, which box are you in for?
Okay.
There you go, you're off the hook. But,
Well, that's okay. It's your significant other. But so that judgment
Which is the
issue to
economy.
measure. The other issue is, take the war on drugs. How much money have we spent on the war on drugs? And I always say, from an economist's perspective, it's spectacular. Because after our, 25-year war, we have managed to lower the price of the street level of drugs.
the other thing to understand is when you're dealing with heads of departments, if you see their schedule, if you hung out with them, they don't have a lot of thinking time. They're moving in 20 and 30-minute blocks at a time. You go to an NSC meeting, it's like being at a road rally. 10-minute discussion, and they mean 10 minutes. At 10 minutes, you move on. 20-minute discussion, and you move on. And I mean, one of the things that always struck me about Secretary Schultz was every so often he would clear part of his afternoon to think. I mean, he'd have to put it on his calendar, and he would take out this long legal piece of paper and say, where are we now? Where does the president need to be in 6 months? How do I get him there? But that is a very rare behavior. Most of them are just moving from pillar to post and being by their executive assistant who's doing the walking brief as you're going down the hall with the manila folder as you go to the next meeting. So they don't have a lot of reflection time. So they're working off their gut most of the time.
Just to on Mark's point, when you look at the DHS chapter, if you talk to the secretaries, Ridge or Judge Chertoff, or currently Napolitano, the number of hearings that is scheduled for them to go and brief the Hill, we're talking about, I think it's 86 committees have jurisdiction over them.
Right.
So if each one of them want to do 2 hearings that year, that's 160 hearings. And when you work at we always say the 7th level of these institutions, the 7th level is where usually the directors, because under the building code, you cannot have buildings over a certain height because of the dome is a restriction. So the 7th floor rats who are usually circulate around the power, you spend a lot of time preparing for getting the agency to prepare for that particular congressional hearing, figuring out what they're doing. And that's a matrix of them. That's accountability. So one of the more ironic issues we had was very early at DOJ, we had to figure out, could anyone list all of the terrorist programs at Main Justice? So guess in the end who was the only person who actually knew all the programs? The person who prepared our budget. Our budget officer had to know because they wouldn't want to be that. So he wasn't a policy person with terrorism. It was a bean counter, lovely guy. He was the only one who we could get in a room and say, so what exactly does that do? Because it's such a mammoth enterprise, that was the matrix, but had nothing to do with what our policy was.
Harvey, you've worked on the Supreme Court. How would you compare the amount of thinking time that's available to the justices?
Well, as the justices always say, they only have three functions. They read, they talk, and they write. As we always say, they're the last 9 who actually do their own work as principals. And the final vote, there are no law clerks in the room as a culture. The 9 go together privately, then they have a discussion. And the other thing about the culture is you would think that you would be able to persuade people with face-to-face meetings. The logic of the court is all paper, because I know how Roger thinks about certain issues. Having a discussion with him is usually not going to change it, but if I send him a memorandum of law, which is 5 or 6 pages with legal citations to his own cases, so he can sit down and reflect, that's usually how the court moves. And the final part of the culture, as the chief used to say, is that what's the most important concept at the court? Brennan used to always say this. He'd look and ask the law clerks, they'd say justice and, rights, and I would go, if I don't have 4 other votes, I'm not writing the majority opinion. The most important idea is I need 4 more votes, then I write the majority, then we're writing the law of the nation. So remember that. We're looking for the 5th vote, and that's why some of the opinions do not as coherent as we would like, because someone says, I want this added in the opinion, and it gets added for that 5th vote. And as we always say, thank God for that lack of coherence, because it means that people like me can get tenure in law schools as we write our law reviews explaining why the opinion is incoherent. That's sort of the culture.
Detlef, right back there. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. You mentioned the interagency process, or the interagency game, as you said, which is meant, of course, to help forge a foreign policy consensus. Can you share your judgment about the effectiveness of the system over time, first question, and B, can you somehow talk us through the process during the Iraq War and what happened or didn't happen?
Roger.
Thank you.
Keep in mind, we only have another 25 minutes.
Well, on the effectiveness question, one thing that's interesting, if you look at the NSC chapter, Dave Arswald notes that there's been an enduring characteristic since George Bush Sr. that we've had this National Security Council, Principals Committee, Deputies Committee, and then sort of the interagency working group level with different names depending on the administration. That structure has basically survived now since George Bush Sr. was in office, which I think reflects a feeling that this is a system that works about as well as we can expect. And what changes is who gets to be in those meetings. Over time, we've broadened the concept of national security, so you have a lot of people in the room in the interagency at various levels who might not have been there in 1947. Domestic terrorism was not on the agenda then. We now have a DHS that attends. We've got health officials who attend, depending on whether the issue is pandemics or food safety. So I think the system has evolved to the point where we're comfortable with the process. The content, though, it depends entirely on how these organizational cultures and the leaders of those organizations behave. In the chapter on the Secretary of Defense, the authors, who are 2 survivors of the Department of Defense, talk about different secretaries who were either very much against or very for a functional interagency process. And you can read the chapter to see who the good guys and the bad guys are. But they both concluded that Don Rumsfeld was not one of the good guys in the interagency process, that it had become dysfunctional. And it started with him deciding this system is not working for the Department of Defense, and he was not going to play. Other secretaries have worked pretty well within the system and felt it should operate and DOD should be a player. That brings us to the case of Iraq. In the chapter by the authors of the Secretary of Defense chapter, they clearly conclude that DOD did not play effectively in this, that it had not chosen to include other agencies early in the process, that it wanted to be in charge. State Department was excluded. That was not the way you need to run an interagency process, particularly if you're looking at the post-conflict consequences. The state chapter, written by Mark Grossman, lays blame not only on the Department of Defense, but also on the Department of State, that they had not been very effective in insisting on certain things. They had not, for example, insisted that when Don Rumsfeld said, we don't need any allies in Afghanistan, we can do it ourselves. You had the famous Article 5, NATO was prepared to go along, and DOD said, no, we don't need it, we don't want you guys there. State should have fought harder for that, because in the end, we did need them. And State had not really held up its end of the game to insist on that. So I think Iraq is a case where the system did not work particularly well. I could mention my chapter on CIA, where CIA was in the dark until August of 2002 on whether or not we were going to war. We had not written on Iraq and the question of what might happen if we go to war, because we didn't know we'd made a decision. And you've heard other former senior officials like Richard Haass talk about, to his knowledge, there never was a decision to go to war. If there is no process, interagency process, where you're discussing the pros and cons of going to war, how is CIA supposed to provide intel support to warn you about the consequences? It was not until after August of 2002 that the CIA began working on 2 papers that looked at what would the fall of Saddam mean, and what would be the domestic consequences and what would be the regional consequences. So we were late to the game, partly because that process had broken down.
I'll let Mark speak afterwards, but on the micro level, the chapter on the FBI, one of the arguments that I put forward is that the reason why we start learning about the coercive interrogation techniques in Guantanamo is because there's FBI agents there. And the agents have been trained that if you use any form of coercive measures, the evidence will not be allowed into trial. So they report back to the director of the FBI purely in a cultural bureaucratic mode. Hey, there are things going on there that's going to make evidence excluded, which then started to unravel some of the issues, and other parts of the bureaucracy were, no, you don't understand. This is something going on here. Why are you reporting that back? We're under a different sets of authorities. It's a classic example of the bureaucracy in our cultures fighting, and it remains to this day. If there's sort of evidence that has been a result of a coercive interrogation and not voluntary, it will not be accepted into an Article 3, which is a federal civil or criminal court. That's a perfect example. We used how the culture is out of step with what's going on, and it reports back, and then there are consequences that they do not understand what the full consequences will be of one federal agent giving testimony against another federal agent about vis-a-vis what has taken place for how information has been gathered.
Just 2 points. If you think about the Cold War experience, this system worked really, really well. We had this abstract concept called containment. We had no visible evidence that it was working. In fact, all the evidence told us it was not working, and we stayed with it year after year after year, and then one evening it worked. That's kind of remarkable. For a country as volatile as we are, to have that much stability and steadiness is kind of odd. Now, the problem we have now is we don't have that lovely defining issue the way we had during the Cold War. The other point I would make, though, is that it is hard to underestimate the importance of the personality of the president in the system. Everything in this book is absolutely true, but at the end of the day, it comes to the guy sitting at this end of that tiny table in the sit room. And his personality, his proclivities, his preferences really, really drive the system. Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter couldn't delegate a thing in his life. I mean, he was concerned about who played tennis on the courts. I could have gotten an E9. I could have gotten an E6 to do this for me. Ronald Reagan delegated everything, and this became a problem. And even though you have this large, pullulating bureaucracy, that one individual's personality has such a dominant effect on the system. I mean, I think that one of the problems, if you read yesterday's New York Times, apparently there was a shouting match in the Oval Office as Egypt was coming apart. Frank Wisner is being yelled at by the president, and Donahue is yelling at Wisner, and Hillary's trying to explain nobody understands this. And I mean, my sense is that this president is very cerebral, but he has trouble saying, all right, knock it off, this is what we're going to do. So you end up with this sort of ad hoc infinite discussion. You really cannot underestimate, and that's why, you know, when you're choosing a president, you got to think about what are they going to be like inside this system, because their personality just pervades everything that happens.
You know, the irony is we passed around that chart when you say what has been one of the most successful international public policy programs conducted by the United States since the Cold War. We have Tom Schelling comes and speaks, the Nobel Prize winner. Well, Schelling was at the heart of the brainiacs who figured out about mad mutually assured destruction and massive retaliation, the idea of how we understood the Cold War. And Schelling will tell you that when they created their concepts, they did not believe they'd actually stop the bomb from being proliferated. They figured within about 10 or 15 years or 20 years, there'd be like 25 or 30 countries that would have the bomb. They were actually stunned about their success vis-a-vis keeping the nuclear club so tiny. And you might argue when we changed our policy, which some in the world interpreted as, if you have the bomb, we will not attack you. And if you have the bomb, if you don't have the bomb, you're vulnerable. That when we moved to that form of a foreign policy, it helped unleash the proliferation problem that the large doctrine of containment, MAD, and whatever went along with it, clearly kept everyone in check. So one of the ironies is that generation was extraordinarily beyond their expectation. And now with 9/11 and 11/9, we're confronting what the book is looking at, this massive understanding of what the doctrine is, because we don't have an assured doctrine for the post-containment world. We've been struggling with that.
We also have no doctrine for Homeland Security. I mean, the doctrine of the Homeland Security Agency is don't let bad things happen. That is hardly a compelling way to organize an enterprise.
Yeah, Stephen Shore.
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm with the PBGC, a federal agency wholly outside security. My question is, how does the need to interface with foreign counterparts, friendly and unfriendly, affect the respective cultures of the security apparatus?
Let Roger go.
Well, different agencies have more or less responsibility to interact with foreign cultures and foreign officials. State Department, obviously, that's their job, to be out there. And as I said, most people want to be out there in a foreign mission somewhere. They don't want to be in Washington. Similarly, the clandestine service, very much be out there, but be careful. That's why we take polygraphs and we have counterintelligence offices, et cetera, et cetera. Other agencies are not out there. And even other parts of the CIA culture are not out there as much as the clandestine service. Analysts, for example, will be mostly Washington-based. And it's ironic that many of us who need to understand foreign cultures because we're writing about them have almost no contact with those cultures. And that is one of the challenges for the CIA culture. How do we get smart on foreign intelligence topics without talking to foreigners? You have to go through some fairly strict regulations on what would permit you to speak with a foreign national about some country or some issue. And that is clearly a result of a dominant culture in CIA that says counterintelligence is a big deal. You should not be talking to foreigners unless you have prior approval. So that's a challenge for us. And I think somehow our culture has to shift. Our CIA culture has to shift to do more risk management than risk avoidance. I did want to add a point. You know, we've been talking about these cultures like they're sicknesses. They're not. We accept that everybody's going to be living in a culture. Wilson Center has a culture. You know, whatever institution you're in has a culture. And for the most part, these cultures have served positive purposes. CIA knows how to write intelligence analysis. It knows how to collect secrets. Because over the 60 years, it's been training people to do that. The problem comes when you become so wedded to a particular way of doing business, but the environment has shifted, that you can't adjust the culture. I've seen changes in my own analytic culture over the 30 years that I've been at CIA. We used to write books, which nobody read.
But they were very well written.
Now we write snowflakes, which are read, but you have to wonder, is there something in between that can capture a little more nuance and detail for the busy policymaker? As Mark was saying, you've got people who have very little time to read, much less think. If only they were all like Eisenhower and have these solarium projects all the time, we'd go down there and muse with him. But we don't have an Eisenhower. We're not in that era anymore. So our culture has shifted, and that's to the good, but sometimes you can overcorrect.
Let me respond to your question. The first is we were very conscious of creating what we refer to as the Washington clock. We always refer to now as there's the Iraq clock and the Afghani clock, and they run on different mechanisms and times. But we were particularly interested in focusing on the Washington clock. What is it about the way our entities pierce the pressure and information, which, as we have seen, may not have a lot to do with the reality on the ground, but that's the reality we've created inside the Beltway. As people say, 22 square miles surrounded by reality is usually how one understands Washington. The second issue is on the bureaucracy of foreigners. During the Bureau period, FREE was deeply committed, because of transnational crime and the way crime was creating connections that we had not seen before of such an international nature, to create something we call legats, legal attaches, which go out to the different embassies. And they're cops. They're reasonably well-polished FBI agents, so, but they are, our argument is they would create a liaison with the law enforcement communities of the host nation. The same way the agency has special relationships with the intelligence officers of the host nation. And that relationship, we thought, culturally, was cop to cop, which we thought, and the cops thought, was apolitical. That's a professional relationship that regardless of what's happening on the chafe of the water taking place in the politics, that the law enforcement agents together would know we're here to stop these crimes, and that's our bureaucracy and that's our culture, and we have more in common with each other than we often have with the relationships. And the way that's done, I see Charlie Mayer's there, so we always talk about culture, but the other side is structure, because it's structure and culture that we were focused on, structural functionalists. So the way I always used to say this is that how that's structured, well, if you look at the cabinet of the president, the FBI director is not there. And the FBI director is not mentioned in the National Security Council papers. Why? Because the FBI director has a 10-year term, and he can only be removed for cause. But the Attorney General serves at the pleasure of the President. So the chief law enforcement officer of the United States is the Attorney General, but below her or him sits this thing called the Director of the FBI. And the Director of the FBI marches to his or her own drummer, because they have a 10-year term, and they control all of the investigative power of the Department of Justice. There's, of course, the Treasury and all this, but for the Bureau. And the reason they're called special agents is because when they started the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the jurisdiction was for special crimes, because you had to create a national entity for special. That's why all our agents are special. And that concept of the bureaucracy you're saying abroad, we have never thought about that, such an extraordinary forward-leaning posture of the Bureau, interacting with their counterparts, and their relationship to the chief of mission, which is who runs the ambassador who runs that embassy, sometimes is a little bit awkward, because we may be running things that we think that the embassy might be involved in some form of corruption, so they report directly back to D.C., not through the State Department channels. It's another level of the complexity that we're trying to demonstrate, that you have to understand that in order to start, when you start monkeying about with what you think the easy relationship is between foreigners and us.
Yes, this gentleman over here. Yeah.
I think it's you.
You're behind you. Yeah.
I have two mics.
Okay.
I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin, but formerly had 30 years in the State Department as an FSO. I wanted to ask
The Foreign Service officer.
Pardon me. I wanted to ask you about the interagency types of cultures you mentioned. Obviously, at the National Defense University, you have some mixing there in somewhat academic environment. Unfortunately, I did attend NDU but I'm wondering if the differences are serious enough that we might consider something for all the security agencies that maybe after 5 years in an agency, when you have a career in front of you, it might be obligatory to have a year or two in another element of the national security apparatus?
Well, they did that in the military now. After Goldwater Nichols, if you're going to get flag rank, you have to do a significant joint tour, which then made it important to go on the joint staff. And in the intelligence community now, Mike McConnell did the same thing. If you're going to get SIS rank, which is the equivalent flag rank, you're going to have to do a significant tour outside of your agency. So those two sort of insular communities have figured that out. It'd probably be a good idea to do it across the board. I don't know what the mechanism would be bureaucratically. I'm sure OPM would go absolutely bananas over this, but it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to understand, you know, the pile that the other guy is standing in, so you have a better sense of where they are.
There was a hand right here. Yeah.
Mark mentioned that the DNI has established this joint duty assignment, and it's early in that process, so that only a few positions have been designated as being giving you credit for getting your joint duty assignment. And in some respects, it's still far too limited. Some of the assignments are literally still within your own building. You don't have to leave Langley to get a joint duty assignment, which I think is a bit of a stretch. We've had a similar problem with foreign language requirements at CIA. They will make waivers for senior officers, you know, because they're so superior in other respects. So I think we're still at the point within the intelligence community where this joint duty assignment has not really been fully embraced. We need to get people out of each other's buildings and into some other buildings, not just give them a title that says they're in a joint duty assignment in the same place. One of our suggestions in the book is that we have more joint training and education opportunities. The military has done this at the National Defense University. It includes State Department officers like Foreign Service officers and civilian officers from the Department of Defense, CIA analysts and operators who come. But it's got to be broader than that, and it's got to be earlier, because at the war colleges, you're already an 05, 06, you're a GS 14, 15. If you've already spent nearly 20 years in your agency, you are deeply imbued with your culture. And changing it at that point is a little hard, although we think we do a pretty good job of breaking down some of those barriers for the year we have our students. If you had something earlier in one's career, similar to, you know, sort of the command and staff college experience that an Army officer has earlier in their career, or you would share space and time and training with others throughout the U.S. government, I think all these people would have a better appreciation for just how diverse the menagerie of agencies and cultures is, and be able to work and understand each other a lot better. Sometimes we talk past each other because we're not speaking the same language.
So to give you an example, I'm on a task force that's chaired by Ambassador Pickering, and we were put together to look at the State Department and how to prepare the State Department to be prepared for the 21st century. So one of the things you immediately realize any time you look at an agency, you ask for the full-time equivalence of the function and see if there's a 10% overcharge. In other words, the military staff, it's 90 people, they will have 99 in the slot. Why? Because at any given time, you assume that someone is going to be out doing training. You're going to have someone who's going to be given out to the interagency for seconding somewhere. You assume you need that 10% overflow. As soon as I look at an organizational chart and I say, do you care about educating your people? And they go, of course. I go, let me look at how you man the job and tell me if it's 10% flow. If they don't know what I'm talking about, I go, you don't really care about education. Because if you do, you do that. And that, given the budgetary times we're confronting and the level of trying to control of our budget, the idea that you would do overflow. And in the law firms, you can always tell among the law firms, among the partners, which is, do you have 7-year sabbaticals the way you give people in educational communities? So in our environment, education, 7 years sabbatical, you're gone. That's a demonstration that the entity cares about you and your writing and your education. In a law firm, you can see that certain senior partners, after 7 years, will say, I'm taking a sabbatical 6 months, I'm going to go do something. That's, you can tell immediately whether or not the culture cares. And to be frank, the State Department was always out of hide. And the State Department, they were not doing it. You were getting waivers. The State Department clearly said about its people, we love you, but we're not going to give you that augmentation. That's the culture. And we said, and Pickering's chairing is, how do you change that?
Yeah.
They always had to talk. They always had the staffing gaps, summer staff.
Yeah.
Rhetoric is always cheap.
Yeah. Your typical military officer will have 4 to 5 years in a career of education and training. CIA analysts and State Department, 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, we used to,
Outside of language.
we used to say the State Department's personnel policy is the Ben-Hur school. You chain them to the roars and tell them to keep rhythm with the guy in the back, and you're going to be fine. I mean, seriously. I mean, the Army, an Army officer, 25 years, retires in 05 or 06, he will have spent 5 or 6 years away from the troops.
There's a piece of legislation that Ike Skelton started before he left office to try and improve cross-agency, whole-of-government training and education opportunities. And we'll see if anything happens with it.
I can see that the sequel to this book is going to be humor in the national security enterprise.
National security stand.
There was one last, I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Someone
Thanks.
has a mic there.
I'm Chris Walker. I work at the Department of Energy. You alluded to fiscal austerity a couple of times, and I was curious if you've given any thought to how that austerity is going to affect any of these agencies' cultures and how they might react.
Well, the problem, when Congress cuts your budget, and I'm speaking from experience here, they don't tell you to do less. They tell you to do the same with less. So that's the first thing, is you have to start, piecing things together. I mean, the first thing that'll go is education and training. Let's see, we can have more officers or smart officers. Well, I'd rather have more officers. I don't care if they're smart. So, I mean, that's going to affect a lot of the agencies. We'll stop. I mean, the growth will stop. The intelligence community has had a huge influx of analysts and of operators. That's going to stop. The Army is going to start giving up brigades. I mean, Gates talking about how much is he talking about cutting? I mean, things will get smaller.
Yeah.
But nobody will tell you to do less. They'll just tell you to make do with less. That's the way this. Nobody will say, "Oh, don't stop doing that." That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
My sense will be you're going to get more pitched battles over jurisdictional fighting, because everyone will understand the jurisdiction will give them a calling card in the process of the budget requests. And an old Mandarin I used to say, you can pay me now or you can pay me later to the appropriators. And the reason he would say that would be, I'm making this request for this number of people to perform this function. You just cut it, got it. Then when we have the bomb that goes off in Oklahoma, and I come to you and I say, I have to launch an investigation, but you've cut me on these people, do you want to have a reprogramming right now so that we can hire them? Or would you like me to go to the American people and say, I would do the job, but we were cut by the Congress for this? So you will find that as disasters and crises evolve, the smart Mandarins will be going up to the hill for the There's going to be a lot of focus now on the current budget situation. And after they have the fights and the blood's in the water, everyone retreats. And then I always say the real Mandarins start looking at reprogramming issues. How you go back to the Congress and say, let's move this money here. And there's never the same number of Klieg lights involved. And as you saying, the crisis will only, as they come, will only reinforce that insider game that takes place in order for you to get the money and the people you need to perform the function if something has just gone bad.
I guess I would add that cooperation across agencies may be a little tougher if money's involved now. A little case study that's in one of the chapters talks about the UAV Predator program that was stood up early in
Unarmed, that's the UAV.
unarmed
Drones.
We now call them systems because they're so small. So
Airborne
it should be
vehicles,
UASs, right?
The UAV program was sort of experimental initially, and we were going to use it against terrorists in Afghanistan, and the NSC was trying to get someone to fund it. The problem was it was sort of run by CIA but operated by Air Force. And you had a pointing contest between the director of CIA and the Air Force saying, you pay. Because they didn't, neither one of them saw it as core to their mission. And it was a program the president wanted, but the NSC had to basically pressure CIA and Air Force to agree on how you would cost share on that little program. Now, if there are other priorities that a president has, and it's not clear whether state, defense, CIA should fund it, there probably is going to be more squabbling over this if there's fewer dollars already on the table.
Well, I hope there's some dollars on the table to buy some of the copies of this wonderful book, which is available outside. And this has really been an incredibly interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and I expect that the rest of the audience has too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia, for doing